Welcome to Keeping Reptiles and Amphibians in Community Enclosures, a theoretical framework by PetFacts TV. Now, just to note, this can be kind of a controversial topic among keepers. I don't think it should be. I figured we'd start off with 3 truths that I think we can all agree to. First of all, across the different realms of keeping, whether that be aquatics or reptiles or amphibians or small mammals, I think we all have very different views on cohabbing. I also think it's fair to say that within the different realms of keeping, we have different views on cohabbing. In nature, habitat is cooperative, and I think that's an important thing to state here. Regardless of what we're keeping in captivity, outside in nature, all of these animals are interacting on the regular basis. And that's really the framework that I like to use to think about reptiles in nature, and that's that reptiles and amphibians live in a neighborhood in the wild. It's not like the Roganification of bears and large cats and things that you've seen on TV, where it's like, you fight, kill. Every day I go outside and I think about my impending death. Like, no, that's not what it is to be a reptile or an amphibian in nature. Reptiles can coexist in shockingly high densities in nature, and that's exhibited by a lot of people that find them in that way in nature. I think it's also important to point out that competition among reptiles in nature is pretty low. There is competition, the food and water and shelter is still a limited resource, but, when you're this big, it's not hard to find a place that's this big to hide or something this big to eat. If you have 2 tigers in a forest, they really are competing for large resources. Snakes and lizards and turtles and frogs all coexist without really competing too much for resources. As such, commensal behavior is the norm. I think most of the time when you see reptiles sitting next to each other, they're not getting anything out of the other one being there, but it's also not a negative thing. And I think that highlights the fact that cohabbing reptiles is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. A big bullet point if done correctly. And that's where the last point comes in. The diverse microhabitats are key in these kinds of cages. Now let's just run through a few key considerations to make when thinking about making a communal terrarium. First of all, enclosure size. The bigger your enclosure is and the more surface area that is within it, the better you're going to do with a cohab tank. Also, another consideration is that large species do not cohab very well. Large lizards fight. Large snakes fight. Frogs, turtles, they all fight. When you're this big, it's much easier to put 5 green tree frogs in a 40-gallon than it is to put 10 ackies together in a very large cage, because inevitably larger animals are going to need larger space. They're also going to need larger microhabitats. It's just much harder to structure a tank for multiple individuals of a larger species. That brings us to the next point. Should you have 2 species or more, or should you just stick with a few individuals of one species? Microhabitats are the key to multi-species enclosures, and I think that the more microhabitats you have within one, and the better you are at constructing them, the better luck you'll have with a multi-species enclosure. Competition, we talked about this. As long as you're feeding your tank right and you're creating the kinds of microhabitats that give your animals the kind of life that they have in the wild, you should be fine. But in this area, the consideration to make is, should I have 5 females or should I have a couple of males in there? Males really like to fight. It's kind of our thing. It's almost like the whole reason that we're here is to fight for female. And so if you have males among females, you're going to get fights. This is a space where I would say 1 male per species per setup. Another thing with that, the more males you have in a tank, the more microhabitats for each lizard you're going to have. So if you had a couple of groups of anoles with a male each, you'll have to have a spot for male here, a spot for male here, and an area in the middle where they don't collide. And my last point, and I really think this is the most important thing to say about this, is that it's really important to choose species with shared ecology. In my paludarium that I have set up just to my right, I have 3 species that all can be found within 10 feet of each other in nature right now. Even if they weren't born in nature where they're interacting with each other, at least by design, they have some of the same key characteristics and they're going to be dealing with things similarly. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the 3 standards for success in community terrariums. First of all, there can be no unevenness. Basically what this means is that if you have 3 anoles and 2 of them are sitting in the sun while one cowers under a log, That's not really a good setup for 3 anoles. It might be a good setup for 2 anoles, but not for 3. Likewise, in my tank setup over here, if my turtle is requiring so much of the cage that my anoles are starting to fall on the wayside, it might be worth considering not having a turtle in that setup and just putting that turtle in its own setup. Second of all, there can be no forced competition. I would like to make a firm line in the sand here. I'm not anti-behavior. In nature, reptiles collide. Sometimes males fight. Sometimes somebody gets chased off. It's good for the brain, at least in my opinion, to go out and have interactions with other animals and to have conflict. Conflict, just like for you and I, if you sit in your house all the time and you never go out and learn how to resolve an argument, the first time you ever have an argument, you're going to fall to pieces. That's not necessarily a perfect analogy in the tank because they're not preparing for anything necessarily, but I do think it is good for reptiles to have a little bit of conflict in their life. And third of all, there can be no predator-prey relationships in the tank. I think this one's pretty obvious at first glance, but if you dig into it a little deeper, it kind of makes sense. In this tank to my right, I have 3 anoles, a squirrel tree frog, and a musk turtle. All 4 of those potentially could end up in the belly of that musk turtle. But musk turtles in the wild don't spend all of their life hunting green anoles and squirrel tree frogs. If it's been 5 years with these anoles and one of them accidentally gets scooped up by a turtle, they still had 5 years of living a pretty dang good life before anything happened. And this is kind of from the world of aquatics where, people will have fish for 5 years, come into their fish room and realize, oops, we had a disagreement last night. If it takes 5 years for something like that to come up, it's probably not that much of a problem in my mind. I'd rather have my anoles sit in a tree and look down in the water and look at a turtle all day long. If that takes a year off of their lifespan, that enrichment, to me, it's worth it. But that brings up the big point and a big standard is that each of these animals should live a wild lifespan. If I have 5 anoles that live to be 5 years old, I feel pretty good about that. Alright, so right now let's use my 45-gallon southeastern United States paludarium as an example. This is actually how I set up this cage and just some of the insight in there. We're just going to say that somewhere in here I'm looking for a microhabitat that I'm creating for the inhabitants of this tank. First inhabitant that's in that tank, and probably the most common in the area, or maybe at least the most observed, is the green anole. So let's click on this one. And here we can see the whole range of the green anole. We'll zoom into around Atlanta just for sake of example. Now let's just go through and look at some of the places that we can see some anoles. Particularly, I'm looking for the more natural looking ones. So like here's an example of 2 anoles sharing a branch. Shouts out Timothy_S78 on this one. This is something that in a cage we could definitely set this up to look like some natural behavior. Here's another example of 3 of them sharing a branch. Shouts out Timothy S78 with the anole ID. That's actually 4 of them. Oh my goodness. And so 5. Oh my goodness. Timothy S with the anoles. Here's a clear example of communal habitat, and it doesn't look like anybody in this photo is exactly having a bad time. There's a bunch of females and a big male. I'm sure that there's a little bit of competition between these females just for that male's attention, but at the end of the day, everybody seems to be doing well. There's nobody with like major scarring. I'm inclined to believe that if we set this up in the right size enclosure, we would have a situation where all these anoles could live together without too much conflict. And so here you can see some more natural looking habitat for anoles. These anoles are almost all certainly either recently spooked or in situ. Shouts out Menendeza17 for some insight. There's a really handsome male hanging out on Palmetto. That's something that easily we could set up in the home aquarium. Here's another one. This is a youngster, it looks like, hanging out on heat leaf. Here we can notice a pattern. This is 2 different anoles using bark, which is, probably something that we can get a hold of fairly easily. And once again, bark. We're seeing a lot of bark in here. Here's a nice example of an anole using a crevice. We can create this in the tank really easily. Alright, so now we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to look for squirrel tree frogs. These guys are a little harder because usually people are seeing tree frogs in places where tree frogs don't be hanging out. Here is an example of a microhabitat that a squirrel tree frog might be using, though this one is not necessarily something I'd want to recreate in a tank. Tree frog is not something that we're going to have to make major considerations with, especially with the anoles. The anoles, they share quite a bit of ecology. Tree frogs are also not that tasty to bite onto. So even if the anoles, initially have some problems with the tree frog, I'm fairly confident that, a couple of bites on that guy and they're going to get it through their heads that he does not taste good. Still, here's a photo that we can see that I have recreated nature perfectly, because this is exactly how my tree frog uses his cage. Yeah, we're hanging on stuff, we're sitting in crevices, we're sitting in cracks. Pretty much anything for the anoles should be good for these guys, but we could also make the assertion that, as you can see in this photo here, we're going to need a little bit more water, we're going to need to be moist, but we can probably be kept fairly similarly to the anoles. Shouts out Rebecca145. And lastly, we're going to do common musk turtle. These guys are super common in Georgia. People find them crossing roads a lot, so we're not exactly going to have the most insightful list of things to be looking to here, and we're going to attempt to find an example of, here we go. Here you can see, you can't see them well, but this is how they're using the habitat above water, logs. We've got lots of branches for basking on. And with a turtle, a big consideration is the kind of ponds that they're living in. It's not very easy to observe turtles in ponds just because they go under the water. See if we can, here we've got a musk turtle sitting in a little bit of habitat in a national forest. We can see under the water. It's fairly clear, but there's still branches and leaf litter and stuff that it's able to hide in. Here we can see that again, fairly clean bottom, but there is some leaf litter and some branches and stuff that they're sitting next to in there. These are good photos because we can get a little bit of a habitat idea with this. Still, you can see it is very shady in here, not a lot of places to bask here, but there are some open watery areas where this turtle was living. Here you can see a individual hanging out in he algae or she algae, whoever algaes. Here's one. You can see this one is more similarly sized to the one that I actually have in there. That's about how big he was when I got him, maybe. We can definitely see a lot of rocks on the bottom, and then here on the on the margin, you can see that shelf. That is an important thing to look for because cover is hugely important in these communal setups. But yeah, we can see tons of stuff in here, just how you don't have to look at too many pictures to understand, these are the kinds of circumstances that these animals will be encountering in the wild, and something that we can just try and recreate in captivity. And then the last step when you're creating, especially a multi-species communal setup, is to find an area where they're all living together and just look at all of the habitat. And really what we're looking through here is we're not looking for photos that have all three of the species together. What we're looking for is microhabitats that we can wrap our head around that might have all three. I hate Joro spiders. I think also with all these bugs that are on here right now, this is a way to consider what we might be able to feed in a communal setup. Also here, field goldenrod, sweet goldenrod, these are all really easy to grow common native plants that if you felt like going that route, here's a great bunch of options. Some Coreopsis and some Rudbeckia. These are also really easy to grow natives. Here's some really nice underwater photos of some fishes that, if not for fish, for the turtle, that's definitely something we could look to for a setup. Here's somebody lizard eating mans. I guarantee you he's eating some anoles. Or she. I don't know. The cat. Don't leave your cats outside, by the way. That sucks. Hey, by the way, please don't. Why do people do this? I have a turtle. Or tortoise, whatever. See, why? Look at it. I have a spur-thighed tortoise. It lives in my house. It's walking in a carpet. Perfect. Here we go. This is a perfect microhabitat right here that I found on iNaturalist that we would be able to use wonderfully to create a microhabitat for all three of the species that I have in the paludarium. Basically, what we're trying to do in a cage like this is we're trying to take a cross-section of this habitat and say this is the habitat that suits all three of these species in a way where they're not going to collide, they're not going to have to compete. We're just going to pick out a cross section that we like, that we think looks usable, and that's what we're going to try and recreate in the next video. I think over here on the left hand side of this image where you have the trees and lots of stuff growing up looks just about perfect. So this has just been kind of an introduction to how I would think about setting up a cage like this.